and it will be for the Leader of the House tomorrow through the business in the normal way to set out what the House will be doing.
But if there isn't an agreement for the House to consider, what would we be discussing on Saturday?
Well, this is why we will see what the progress is today, and it will be for the Leader of the House, as is the norm, on Thursday to set out the order of business. And that's what he alluded to yesterday, and it'll be for the Leader to set out.
But what would, just so I'm clear, what would be the point in the House meeting if there wasn't an agreement to discuss?
Well, you'll be familiar with your own legislation and the timescale that it sets. And that is why, as I say, it will be for the Leader of the House to set out whether we will be sitting or not, and it will obviously relate to the negotiations and the progress we're hoping to make today.
But the legislation, as you'll be well aware, is only relevant in those circumstances if there is an agreement which the government can put to the House to seek to get consent for it. If that consent is given, then the requirement to write a letter doesn't apply. So if there's no agreement, then I don't see how the Act is relevant as far as Saturday's business is concerned.
But the argument that was run yesterday by the member for Brocstow was the opposite of that, which was that there's no requirement in the legislation for the House to sit in any event on Saturday. What I am saying is there are a number of issues that interplay with the legislation in your name. The normal course of business is not that ministers set out that during the week. It is set out by the Leader of the House. That is what the Leader of the House said to in the Chamber yesterday, and that is the position.
Right, are you currently discussing a revised political declaration with the European Union?
Yes, we are.
And so you've submitted draft text?
We have submitted draft text as part of the negotiations on a number of aspects under discussion. As you will be aware, the position of the government was set out by the Prime Minister in his letter to President Juncker, on the 2nd of this month. And if there are changes to the backstop element of the Northern Ireland Protocol, then it stands to reason there would be consequential changes to the political declaration that flow from that as a consequence.
Okay, and would you expect the text of that revised political declaration to be available at the same time as a revised legal text on the withdrawal agreement whenever it becomes available? Would we see them both together?
Well, again, there's a number of areas of text that will be required, but we'd be seeking to put as much information before the House as possible in terms of the text that will be available.
But I'm just trying to establish whether they'd be available simultaneously, because presumably for there to be an agreement, it would have to be an agreement on both the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. Is that correct?
Well, it wasn't for the third meaningful vote, as you will recall, because the third meaningful vote was purely on the withdrawal agreement. It was not on the package, but you'll be also aware, Chair, that the first and second meaningful votes were very much on the package. In fact, you spoke very eloquently around your concerns in terms of the blind Brexit element of the political declaration, and yet when we got to the third vote, it appeared that actually the political declaration wasn't the issue. In the way that it was referred to in the first and second votes, because when we had the third meaningful vote, which was a standalone vote on the withdrawal agreement in isolation, the three components being issues which many had previously said they agreed with, citizens' rights, Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the financial settlement, the House did not carry the withdrawal agreement in isolation. So again, part of this depends on the progress that we make in the talks, but also in terms of the interplay with your own legislation.
Okay. Can you confirm that if there is no agreement reached, which is approved by Parliament on Saturday, that by the end of the day the Prime Minister will write the letter that he is required to send by the European Union Withdrawal Number 2 Act?
Well, I can confirm, as the Prime Minister has repeatedly set out, that firstly the government will comply with the law, and secondly it will comply with undertakings given to the court in respect of the law.
Well, the undertaking given to the court was that subject to section 1.5, in the event that neither of the conditions set out in sections 1.1 and 1.2 is satisfied, he will send a letter in the form set out in the schedule. Can you confirm for the committee, as the Secretary of State, that in those circumstances he will send the letter?
I confirm that the government will abide by what is set out in that letter.
Which will involve sending a letter, is that right?
You read it out, and I
helpful.
refer back to that text.
Well, that's hopeful that you have confirmed that he will send that letter. Do you know why the Prime Minister spent so long saying that he wouldn't?
Well, we're committed to leaving, as you know, Mr Benn, on the 31st of October. We think the best way of doing that is with a deal, to leave in a smooth and orderly way. That is why the team are, as we speak, involved in intensive negotiations to do that. We think there's a political will on both sides to do that, and that is the best way, in our view, of meeting the legislation requirements that you set out.
Okay, but if the Prime Minister sends the letter, and he's promised to do that, and you confirm that, and if an extension to the 31st of January is offered, he has promised to accept it, because that's what the court in Scotland was told. Can you explain then how the UK is going to leave the EU on the 31st of October? Because the two things don't square, do they?
Well, I think there's a number of, to quote the Speaker, we'll cross that bridge in due course, is the way the Speaker would usually put it. There's a number of variables that apply to what is a complex piece of legislation, but the first way of meeting the test that you have set out, Mr Benn, through your legislation, is to have a deal. And the full effort of government is focused on that. That is why I was in Luxembourg yesterday. It's why the technical team were in discussions past midnight UK time last night. It's why those discussions are ongoing as we speak. And we are absolutely committed to securing a deal. We think that is in the interest of both sides. Certainly I had 11 bilaterals with counterparts in Luxembourg yesterday. The consistent message in all of those bilateral meetings was a desire on the EU side to have a deal, and that is absolutely what we're focused on delivering.
I understand that entirely. I'm just trying to establish that if no agreement is reached and the Prime Minister sends the letter as he's promised to do and asks for the extension and the EU grants one to the 31st of January, then we can't leave on the 31st of October, can we?
You're, with respect, Chair, as is absolutely your right, but you're, I think, getting several steps ahead. I think the key issue before is are we able to reach an agreement that would satisfy the terms of your legislation if we do so. But these are issues for the House to determine in due course. But what is essential is we reach agreement with the EU, and then the question is whether that is deliverable within the UK Parliament, and that is the test on which we are focused. And I think the other issues which quite understandably you seek to lead me towards are issues for the future. The issue before us today, from a government point of view, is how do we deliver a deal and leave the EU in a smooth and orderly way, because the Prime Minister and the government is absolutely committed to leaving on the 31st of October.
Well, I can understand why you don't want to answer that question, as is your right, but perhaps we could move on. If an agreement is reached, how long do you think it would take to get the WAB and ratification through Parliament?
Well, I think based on your legislation, Chair, it's very clear that this is a House that can move very quickly when it wishes to do so, as we also saw in the legislation from Yvette Cooper. So as you well know, it is for the House to control in terms of programme motions, in terms of the passage of legislation, and to determine what level of scrutiny it deems relevant. But based on your own legislation, I think it's clear that this is a House that can move very quickly when it wishes to do so. I think it's also the case that the House has shown a desire not to have a no-deal outcome, and therefore, if given an opportunity to vote on a deal and to pass a deal, can move quickly. I'm very aware that it's a significant piece of legislation in the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, but we are confident we can deliver that by the 31st of October.
Right, now the issues that appear to be at the heart of the current negotiations are customs and consent, and I want to take you back to the proposal which the government originally published. It was briefed, it was its best and final offer. Clearly it was just its opening offer. But on the question of consent, the proposal the government put forward said that if the Northern Ireland Assembly rejected the common area for agri-food and manufactured goods, then the idea would lapse, and after a year, arrangements would default, and I quote, to existing rules. What existing rules?
Well, what we set out was the position in the letter of the 2nd of October, and as you correctly referred to, Chair, what that did was have a consent, a principle of consent, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves as to why that was there. And that is there because the previous withdrawal agreement bill was voted down 3 times because of concerns raised, including by members of your committee, around the fact that under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, it requires the consent of both communities in Northern Ireland, and there was a concern, not just within the DUP, but I think in the wider unionist community, that the backstop did not have that wider consent. And I think there was also a concern in terms of laws applying in Northern Ireland over which people would not have a say. And therefore, in the package of proposals the Prime Minister has brought forward, reflecting, if one goes back to 2017 and the Commission's own mandate to be creative and flexible on the border of Northern Ireland, it reflected that flexibility by addressing many of the challenges that I and others have heard in capitals around the flow of agricultural goods north-south. That is why there was the proposal on the regulatory zone, but it needed to be covered with the principle of consent in order to address why Parliament had rejected this 3 times previously.
Indeed, and I do understand that, Secretary of State, but my question was, you said in the explanatory note that if that arrangement were rejected by the Assembly, then arrangements would default to existing rules. And I'm asking you to explain to the committee what existing rules, because at that point we would have left the European Union. So what are the existing rules that arrangements would default to?
Well, the existing rules one would default to in that instance would be the same rules that would apply if we left in the event of no deal.
So that would involve customs checks, regulatory checks, and the whole...
In that instance, so if consent was withdrawn, that would be the case. Now, the question that would arise as to how feasible would one expect that to be, and the question then is, in the timescale, how much divergence would one have expected over that period of time? The likelihood is extremely little. Would consent being withdrawn when the European Parliament ratifies after the UK Parliament and could therefore see whether the legislation had been supported in the passage of the bill. But what you draw me into, and these are obviously issues of live discussion, is the mechanism through which consent would operate. And I think the more important issue today is, in terms of the package of discussion, is around the principle of consent, because it is the principle that needs to address why this legislation failed 3 times previously. Now, it is for the negotiation, and you said at the outset, Chair, that there will be areas which I think I hope colleagues can understand of deep sensitivity, given that these are live negotiations going on as we speak, in terms of the mechanism that would apply. But the wider point in terms of today is that the legislation failed 3 times because of concerns around its democratic nature, and therefore there needs to be consent as a principle to address that.
Again, I say to you, I understand that very clearly from the document you produced, but you have confirmed to us that if that were to be the proposal finally agreed, and if the Assembly declined to adopt those proposals, it would result in a hard border. That is correct, isn't it?
But if, and we're into the details of the mechanism. So it is the case that if consent, well, firstly, if there was no deal, then leaving on no deal would inevitably mean that these issues would crystallise immediately. So a starting point is to have an agreement means that these issues are not crystallising on the 1st of November. But the point is, I think more widely, and I think is recognised, that what was of concern to the House previously was the lack of consent over the application of laws in Northern Ireland over which people didn't have a say, and the fact that one of the 2 communities was not in agreement. So the question then is, how do you design a mechanism that,
Again,
that addresses
I say
that.
to you, I understand that, but how could the government propose something that, if the consent was not granted, would result in a hard border when the government has consistently said its policy is to keep the border as it is now? I don't understand.
We have been consistent. When you talk about hard border, that would be coming if that arose on the EU side. We have been absolutely consistent in our commitment to no infrastructure at the border in Northern Ireland. The proposals we have set forward, if you look at the first item of the 5 set out by the Prime Minister, it reaffirms the government's commitment to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And part of that commitment is that there will be no infrastructure put up on the border in Northern Ireland. And that is a position that the previous government took. That is a position the current Prime Minister has been very clear on.
But it was the government's policy, I don't know whether it still is, that customs checks could take place, but away from the border, either at premises or other designated locations. Is that correct? That was the proposal.
Well, that wasn't just a position of the UK government. At Strasbourg, the Commission also accepted the principle of alternative arrangements, and that was something that both...
What's that?
I'm just wondering what we're doing here. I mean, you've had the floor now for 20 minutes. I doubt there's any other member will have the floor for 20 minutes during this discussion this morning. And I would welcome an opportunity for others to speak.
Yes, I mean, others will all get
And you know, with respect, rather biased because you're pushing the Ben Act through, so I'd personally like to see the chair as well.
Well, your comments are noted. The final question I want to ask, before I bring other members in, is turning now to the government's wish for a Canada-style free trade agreement. Can you confirm that if that were what were to transpire, that it would involve customs checks and regulatory checks and rules of origin checks?
Well, it's absolutely the case that we are committed to Northern Ireland coming out of the EU customs union, right. And to having, and we may get into questions around the political declaration and our commitment to a best-in-class free trade agreement. We're also committed, as the Prime Minister set out in his letter, to minimising any checks that are required. You'll be very well aware that, particularly on manufactured goods, for example, it's only a very low percentage of goods that are checked in any event. You'll be aware that we start from a position of regulatory alignment based on over 40 years of membership of the EU. So again, we start to stray into questions of detail, but it is a point of law that if you have two customs unions, then obviously one needs to balance how the trade flows between those two.
Very helpful. Thank you very much. Andrea Jenkins.
As someone who's been a great critic of the government's approach to Brexit, I have to say, since Prime Minister Boris Johnson's took the role, I think he's doing a fantastic job, and his approach to Brexit and ensuring that the referendum result is respected. Number one, how would you say the approach to negotiations has changed since the previous Prime Minister to now? How has your role changed and how has the approach changed?
Well, my role has changed insofar as previously I was much more focused on the preparation for no deal. That is now led by the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster, who I know has given evidence to the committee on that issue. And my focus has been on the negotiations. So in terms of within government, there has been a change. I think from a government point of view, the change of approach, I would refer you back to the letter sent by the Prime Minister to President Tusk in the summer, which set out the changes that the Prime Minister was seeking to make to the deal. But as someone who served both Prime Ministers, what would I say? I would say both have shown an absolute commitment to securing a deal. And that is very much what is informing the current Prime Minister's approach.
Thank you, Minister. And just finally, do you believe the Ben Act has weakened the negotiating hand of the government and our country?
I think it has been unhelpful to the negotiations, absolutely. But I think what is recognised both in the EU and the UK is the time is now for a deal. I think there is, certainly reflected in the discussions I had yesterday, there is a desire to get a deal, a recognition that it is in both sides' interests to do so, and the teams are working extremely hard in order to take that forward.
Splendid, thank you very much. Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask you a little bit about the consequences if there isn't a deal and if the UK leaves the EU without a deal, which is clearly, as we speak, still on the cards. Operation Yellowhammer warned that food and medicine shortages would result from long delays at Dover, if there were long delays at Dover. This morning, the National Audit Office has told us that the government currently expects cross-channel flows to be between 45% to 65% of current levels on day one of a no-deal Brexit because of two factors, and we've taken evidence about these in recent weeks. One is the lack of trader readiness, combined with a limited space in French ports to hold unready lorries. What, in your view, would a reduction of cross-channel flows by at least a third, 35% to 65%, we're told is the current government estimate, what would a reduction of cross-channel flows on that scale mean in practice in the UK?
Yeah. So I saw that NAO report as well, and I think what was heartening for government within it was the recognition that significant improvements have been made, and the government has done a huge amount of work on this. That's reflected, for example, in the 900 or so Border Force officers that have been recruited, the £108 million of funding that's been allocated, the public awareness campaign, the automatic allocation of ERE numbers to businesses, the 1.5 million letters that have gone out, and so forth. And the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster, I'm sure, could give evidence of a whole range of things that have been done. To give you perhaps an illustration, because obviously I'm much more focused on the negotiations than Yellowhammer, but if I go back to when I was involved in this, I remember a report back in November that talked about a 10% increase in food prices. That's how it was always portrayed in Parliament. Actually, the figure was 5 to 10%. It's 30% of our food that is imported from the EU, 50% is sourced in the UK, 20% rest of the world. Of that 30%, it was based on a border assumption that was far worse than the one, Mr. Timms, that you have just quoted. It assumed a currency devaluation, which I think is at odds with what most people would now envisage. And so my point being is that you often get these figures quoted that are not reflective of the circumstances even reflected in your own question with the border flow, that don't reflect the work that the subcommittee XO, chaired by CDL, has done, meeting 5 times a week throughout the summer. That doesn't mean that we're in any way complacent, that there will be challenges and disruption. I was at the port of Rotterdam last week, discussing with them the massive amount of work that has been done. Because it's, again, parliamentary-wise, we tend to talk about Calais a lot, whereas actually there's a huge amount of goods coming in through the other ports, the container ports in particular. So we are very aware that there are challenges. The NEO themselves recognised a huge amount of work has been done, and that work is very much ongoing.
No, the NAO does recognise the work that's been done. I think over the summer we were told that the expectation was that trade flows would be 40 to 60% cross-channel, and they're now projected, this is the government assumption, we're told by the NAO, is 45 to 65%. So that's clearly an improvement, but it's still a very dramatic reduction in cross-channel flows. In a speech in Madrid last month, you made the point that we felt within the UK, and I think you were right to say that. But what do you think the impact would be in the UK if there were 2.5 days of delay at Calais?
Well, I'd say two things. I think, firstly, the message I got from businesses and leaders in Spain was the same as in Poland and elsewhere, which is they don't believe that it will be 2.5 days, and they're set to work with us to ensure that we have as smooth a flow of goods as possible. I mean, to give you an example from Poland, a huge amount of fresh poultry, 84,000 jobs in Poland in the poultry industry. If you're a delay in terms of fresh poultry, obviously that is hugely significant in terms of their flows in. So the point I was making in Madrid is that there is a massive shared desire to get a deal. That is what we're focusing on today, and that is shared by EU capitals and by the Commission, that it is a win-win for us to have a deal, and that's what we're working on. But if there is the situation of no deal, then it will be in the mutual interest of both sides to mitigate that as best as possible. And I think you referred to Madrid. Madrid was really just giving some colour to that.
I mean, Operation Yellowhammer said that delays of that order would lead to shortages of some fresh foods and medicines in the UK. That is the case, isn't it? That is the government's expectation if we have delays of the kind of order you were talking about in Madrid.
Well, that's why I'm saying I don't think there will be those delays. But of course, if there's a delay to goods coming in, and if you take my example of fresh poultry as an example, that is damaging. The question is there a will on the EU side to work with us? Yes, that's partly why, as in places like the Port of Rotterdam, discussing that, and we have those discussions with EU members. But ultimately, this is why both sides see the benefit of reaching a deal, and the challenge in the next 24, 48 hours is how we work together to achieve that.
I understand. The National Audit Office is saying the current government expectation is that flows across the channel, including Rotterdam, all of them, would be 45 to 65% of current levels on just after a no-deal Brexit. That does mean very long delays at Dover and Calais, doesn't it?
Well, as I've sought to do, Mr. Timms, a huge amount of work is going on to mitigate those delays. We can go through the steps that EXO has taken. Yep. For example, the 31 million that it's allocated to boost customs agents, to increase automation, postponing of the accounting of import VAT, reaccession to the Common Transit Convention.
But the benefits of all
so there's a work stream
so
in government. The point is, it is in both sides' interests to avoid that if it arises, but the far better way of mitigating that is through a deal, and we are absolutely committed to working with a deal. And I think if one looks at comments made by EU leaders in recent days, it's very clear there is a shared desire, both in EU capitals, in the Commission, and within the UK, to reach a deal.
Just one other aspect, if I may, Chair, if we did leave the EU without a deal, the Revenue and Customs told us last week that the administrative burden of completing customs declarations for all EU trade in goods movements on both sides of the EU border would be £15 billion per year. I think we can all remember when the Conservative Party, I think rightly, used to be very sensitive to extra burdens on business counted in the millions. Here we've got a forecast of billions in additional red tape burdens. Wouldn't burdens on that scale be catastrophic for many UK businesses?
Well, as a former Treasury Minister, Mr. Timms, I know you, as I do, listen very closely to the wishes of the business community. And the best way of addressing, whether it's the figure you quote or a different figure, the best way of addressing this is through a deal and a clear message, whether it's the letter in the Telegraph this morning from business leaders, or whether it is the numerous conversations I, and I'm sure you have, with business leaders up and down the country. The very clear message one gets from business is they want to see a deal. And I think if we are able to bring a deal back to the House, I think the key question for all members of Parliament is whether it is in the national interest to support a deal, to ensure the flow of goods is maintained, to deliver an implementation period, to safeguard the aspects of the withdrawal agreement I'm sure you would agree with, like citizens' rights. And that will be the question that members of the House need to address.
If we did have a no-deal Brexit and there was that kind of additional burden, would the government take steps to mitigate the billions of extra red tape burdens?
Well, if you know, my whole focus is on trying to secure a deal. That is what I've worked throughout the summer on. It's what I'm working on now. It is what the Prime Minister, it's what David Frost and the entire government is focused on getting the deal. And because I have said, when I've been before this committee previously sometimes, slightly to annoyance of one or two of my colleagues, that a no deal is disruptive, and I have always supported a deal. We can get into detail as to how disruptive a no deal is, but the reality is a deal is a far better outcome for the United Kingdom. And I think the question will come to members of Parliament who today have not supported a deal is whether they are now willing to do so, because I think that is the way we respond to the concerns of business, but also we actually move the country forward.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. When Michael Gove sat there a few weeks ago, he was asked whether, if there was such a scenario in which Theresa May's deal came back to the House of Commons, would he vote for it? And like a shot, he said he would. Would you?
He said yes. I read the transcript last night, so I think he said yes. Well, I voted it 3 times, so yes.
Okay. What makes you think that the deal that's currently being negotiated is substantially better than the deal that was previously negotiated?
Well, I think first and foremost because I think the deal will be deliverable. And the key issue with the previous deal was the House of Commons rejected it 3 times. And I think there have been, in my discussions with the EU, 2 central issues. The first is whether we can agree a deal that addresses the mutual concerns and equities of the 2 sides. But then the second question they say to me is, and will it be deliverable in the House of Commons? Perfectly legitimate question. And I think the key issue that came out of the debates, and I know Mr. Crabb, you spoke in many of them, was the concerns around the backstop, and for reasons we've already touched on. And that, in terms of the letter that the Prime Minister sent to President Tusk in the summer, was particularly focused in on that issue, distinct from the Northern Ireland Protocol as a whole. So, for example, the Common Travel Area, the Single Electricity Market, North-South cooperation within the protocol is distinct from the backstop elements. So we have addressed that, but also I think what the Prime Minister has done is be very clear in terms of the future relationship that he is seeking in terms of a best-in-class free trade agreement. And I think that therefore gives colleagues across the House the opportunity then to move forward.
Okay. If you feel that the current direction of negotiations are leading to a better deal than the one that was previously negotiated by Theresa May, what do you think was it that made members of the ERG group who were briefed in Downing Street last night so angry?
Well, I mean, I was travelling back from Luxembourg last night in order to attend today's committee. I've always, Chair, I think, tried to be a regular attender of your committees. So obviously I wasn't in for that meeting. I can't, therefore, given that I wasn't there, Mr. Crabb, speculate on what was said or was not said.
Is it fair to say that we're broadly moving in the direction of a Northern Ireland specific backstop as opposed to a UK-wide backstop, which was, of course, the big concern and stumbling block in the previous agreement?
Well, again, I mean, one doesn't want to get into sort of the detail of negotiations that are ongoing, but what was the 5th pillar of the Prime Minister's letter to President Juncker on the 2nd of October was making it very clear the importance of the UK, the United Kingdom leaving, as he has repeatedly said in the Chamber, whole and entire. And I think that is absolutely fundamental to the government's approach, and that is a point we've made very clear.
But that characteristic which you described of leaving entirely and as one, within that, do you accept it's now the government's position that for Brexit to be meaningful for the UK, Northern Ireland will inevitably be treated slightly differently?
Well, what I've made it clear is that the sovereignty of the United Kingdom needs to be respected. The Prime Minister has been very clear in terms of the importance of that vis-à-vis the customs union. And again, I think I would refer back to the comments that he's made on that point.
Okay. And look, just finally, Mr. Chairman, we obviously wish you well in the days ahead. If it does look like we can get a deal in the coming days, and it looks like we will need a bit more time to do the legalese around it, would you be comfortable with a short technical extension to get it done?
No, I think it is important that we leave on the 31st of October. I think the House has demonstrated through the Benn legislation, through the Cooper legislation, its ability to legislate in a quick manner. I think many of these issues have been discussed. I think the one issue that most people don't feel is that the House of Commons hasn't discussed Brexit or the withdrawal agreement on enough occasions. I think the issues are very well known to colleagues, and I think the important thing is, and particularly as I say when I listen to the voices of business, and also to many many constituents and citizens. They want to get Brexit done. They want the country to move forward. They want to do so in a smooth and orderly way. That is the opportunity we have.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Craig McKinley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to concentrate on the political declaration and what is happening on that at the moment. I mean, one of the reasons that many of us were very concerned about Theresa May's withdrawal agreement was some looseness of words, but the sort of seeming direction of travel that to us seemed to be perpetual vassalage, building upon the customs territory, high alignment on all manner of things, and of course that very woolly word of best endeavours, which can mean different things to different people. So I was very pleased to see in the Prime Minister's letter of 2nd of October to President Juncker, and I'll just quote one of the final paragraphs. Together with finalisation of the necessary changes to the political declaration reflecting the goal of a comprehensive free trade agreement. Now that was very welcome, and it was the first time we'd really seen a clear statement from the government that was the direction of travel that we'd like to see. So obviously that, putting aside the issues on the island of Ireland, that is very similar to what Donald Tusk offered in March 2018. Now, how is progress from the government, UK government side, how is that being perceived, trying to flesh out that high-level free trade agreement? How is that being perceived by the EU side at the moment?
Well, I think there's a shared desire to get on to the future relationship. I think that is something that both sides recognise is the best way forward. I think what is often lost in this process is the fact that we have been debating for a very long time now the winding down provisions and not actually the future trade agreement. There's obviously an interplay between that agreement and also the other trade deals that the Department for International Trade and Liz Truss will be looking to secure. And so there is a shared desire to get onto the future economic partnership and to have those discussions. And again, that is why I think the time is now for us to agree what is, in essence, the winding down provisions, enable us to get onto those trade talks.
I've always thought one of the Brexit dividends is the ability to make new free trade deals around the world. And I believe that's the Prime Minister's ambition as well. So when the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and yourself have said that if Theresa May's withdrawal agreement were back, you would agree to that, given that it would be a distinctive hindrance to those international trade deals because we'd have very little to offer in terms of access to our markets and differences in regulatory alignments. Do you still stand by that? Would you honestly still vote for Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, given that I know you to be an international free trader and know the benefits of global free trade for just the general direction of the health of nations? So I'm concerned that there are anyone left in the government that would actually still is an adherent to that old deal.
Well, without wanting to rerun previous debates that we've had on the committee, of course, what was said to me at the time was, on the one hand, the political declaration didn't have legal force and therefore was a worthless set of commitments, and yet at the same time it was binding on issues like security, cooperation, or its constraint in terms of trade deals, and notwithstanding the linkage between Article 184 and the political declaration, obviously there's an inherent contradiction within that position. So, but I don't think it's helpful for us to go back over old ground. I think the key issue is the Prime Minister has been very clear in terms of what future economic partnership he is seeking. It is a best-in-class free trade agreement. What do we mean by that? It means that it's not just about applying CETA, but it's looking at what precedent there is from the EU in terms of trade deals they have done around the world and seeking to build on that. But it is also signalling our desire for a close security relationship as well, as part of being, as the Prime Minister said out in his conference speech, a European country with European values that geographically remains extremely close to Europe, that does a very sizable proportion of its trade with Europe and wants to get onto that positive future relationship. And the issue before us is the winding down provision before we get on to the debate on the future economic partnership, on which I'm sure the House will wish to have a view in due course.
Just finally, the government is exuding positivity about a new political declaration. Are you sensing that the other side now finally get it as the destination that they've offered in the past? Do they seem to be amenable to what we're suggesting to them on the political declaration, whether it's enforceable or not, which is, of course, another matter?
Sure. Well, I mean, as you'd expect me to say, Mr. Kinley, it is a negotiation, and both sides have equities within that. We haven't got into the debate, for example, on areas like level playing field and how that interplays, but the EU will have legitimate areas of interest that they will want to protect, as is quite proper. But the point that I was signalling is, as the Prime Minister has set out, is our commitment to have a best-in-class free trade agreement, and a big part of that is the global approach that we want to have in terms of other trade deals with other countries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pat McFadden.
Thanks for coming. I want to ask you a few questions about these level playing field provisions, if I may. In the withdrawal agreement as it stands, at Annex 4, Part 3, there's what's called a non-regression of labour and social standards clause. It says, the Union and the UK shall ensure the level of protection provided for by law, regulation and practices is not reduced below the level provided by the common standards applicable within the Union and the UK at the end of the transition period in the area of labour and social protection, fundamental rights at work, occupational health and safety, fair working conditions and so on. There's a similar clause on the previous page relating to environmental standards. Yet in the memo issued by the government on the 2nd of October, at paragraph 4, it says there is therefore no need for the extensive level playing field arrangements envisaged in the previous protocol. Can you explain to us why the government now wants to depart from those previous commitments in the withdrawal agreement to level playing field clauses on labour, social standards, environmental protections, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, you raise an important issue, and I think the key principle I would start with when looking at level playing field is what is the outcome one is seeking, and there are different ways of achieving that. Now, if you look at the Queen's speech, where the Prime Minister set out our desire to be best in class on environmental standards, his very strong wish to have global leadership on that and to have a number of areas where we have a very strong regulatory standard on the environment. If you look at historically within the UK in a whole range of areas has been ahead of Europe. I mean, the two obvious ones would be on maternity rights and parental leave. And I don't think there's any desire within the House to have, it's actually the former Chancellor in a speech to De Bilde who talked about Singapore on the Thames, but I don't think there is any desire to have a deregulatory approach. The question is, to what extent do you have sovereign control of your regulation, and to what is the interplay between your regulatory commitments and your market access, and that has long been a feature of trade deals, and that will be, I'm sure, part of the discussion with the EU moving forward.
But the fact is, legally speaking, the government's intention is no longer to have the commitments that I read out from Annex 4 in the future. That's just a factual position.
Well, it's part of the negotiation, obviously, to discuss, but I would refer you back to a slide that Task Force 50 themselves produced, which showed what they had, which was basically a staircase, which was the linkage on their slide between market access and regulatory commitments. And I mean, that is a feature. If you look at the commitments within CETA, that is also the case in terms of the interplay between access and regulatory commitments. I mean, that is part of a trade deal. The more fundamental point is the government is not looking to deregulate. The Queen's speech gives evidence of that approach, but it is the case, as part of a best-in-class free trade agreement, that gives a clarity whereas the previous political declaration was wider in scope, and therefore that is part of the discussion that we can have.
Well, let me turn to the similar paragraph in the political declaration. You've confirmed, as far as the withdrawal agreement goes, you want to replace these paragraphs which I've been referring to, and not to have those non-regression commitments. But looking forward to the future relationship, the political declaration as of the moment, at paragraph 79 says, the future relationship must ensure fair and open competition. Provisions to ensure this should cover state aid, competition, social and employment standards, environmental standards, climate change, relevant tax matters, building on the level playing field arrangements, which we just discussed, which will no longer apply, provided for in the withdrawal agreement. So, again, is that text which in an amended future political declaration the government is now seeking to change or to remove that paragraph?
No, well, you mentioned state aid, for example, so let me give you an example. The UK currently spends 0.4% GDP on state aid. The EU average is 0.8%, Germany spends 1.3%. But it is perfectly in order for, as part of the negotiation, for there to be a discussion as to what is the balanced approach on areas such as level playing field. I mean, that is a part of the negotiation. Now, again, you wouldn't expect me today, as we are in the middle of the negotiation, to get into the detail of that negotiation. But where the balance lies and how that is assessed is part of a normal negotiation in the course of these things. But if you look at our starting point, the UK is not a country that has abused state aid, and that is reflected by the position. So the idea that we would use state aid to advantage our businesses at the expense of those in Europe is belied by what the current data shows.
What I'm trying to establish by way of text is whether the government is seeking to change the provision that Theresa May's government had signed up to under the paragraph I've read out. Are you seeking to change that commitment?
Well, as I say, I'm not going to get into the detail of the negotiation. What I'm saying is what matters on commitments around level playing field is the balance of that and the outcome that is being sought, and there are different ways of achieving
Can I just try one final question with you? In terms of the paragraphs that I've read out from the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration about the future, if there is new text on those things which cover level playing field provisions on social and environmental standards, labour standards and so on, will Parliament see that new text before being asked to vote on any revised deal?
Well, again, I mean, that refers to the discussion we had at the start, but I am very alive, Mr McFadden, not least from the talks we had with the Labour front bench in terms of the interest that there is across the House from members around the commitments. What I'm, without getting into the detail of negotiation and signaling this morning, is the government, as reflected in the Queen's speech, is not a government looking to deregulate its environmental standards or in other areas, but it is right as part of giving clarity as under the best-in-class free trade agreement that the text reflects that, and that is a point of negotiation that we're discussing.
If there's no desire to depart from the level playing field, why not sign up to it? I mean, this does matter a great deal to I'll say to Labour MPs, possibly to MPs from other parties, but it certainly matters a great deal to Labour MPs. And do you understand the concerns that would arise on the Labour benches if the government resiles from these paragraphs that I've read out?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I hear the point.
Okay. Jonathan Johngley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just picking up on Pat McFadden's points, just for clarification, really. Under the new political declaration, did I pick up that we would be moving to a Canada-type approach when it comes to negotiating a new FTA? Did you actually say that?
Say again, sorry, Mr.
We would move to a Canada approach when it comes to negotiating the new FTA.
No, what I said is that the Prime Minister has sought changes to the backstop in the withdrawal agreement specifically due to the fact that the previous agreement failed 3 times and that was central to that issue. And that in that will have consequential changes within the political declaration as a result of that. And that secondly, that in seeking a best-in-class free trade agreement, that likewise enables a discussion as part of the negotiation as to how that is best reflected in the political declaration.
So let's say, for instance, a Canada-style deal is put into the political declaration, or for this purpose, any other particular formula. Would that actually be binding, or would it just be a declaration pointing the way that could, for instance, be changeable by a future administration?
Well, again, on the one hand, I'm told that political declaration doesn't have force. On the other hand, I'm told that it is binding.
I'm asking
and it's
you.
kind of constrained. So whether there is a good faith commitment and the linkage through Article 5 in terms of good faith, Article 184 in terms of the interplay between the withdrawal agreement and the political